It was a bright, busy morning at the only bank in the small town. Businessmen in neat suits were waiting in line. Rich women were talking loudly about their shopping plans. And young tellers were counting stacks of money behind the glass counters. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sound of coins clinking and papers shuffling. Everything felt normal until the glass doors opened slowly. An old black man stepped inside. His clothes were worn and faded, the edges of his shirt frayed, and his shoes looked like they had walked through many years. Over his shoulder, he carried a heavy brown sack, the kind that farmers used for grain. It looked out of place in the shiny, polished bank. People turned their heads, staring. Some whispered. Others chuckled quietly. To them, he looked like just another poor old man, the kind who didn't belong in such a place. He didn't rush. His steps were slow, steady, as if he had all the time in the world when he reached the front counter. A young teller with perfect hair and a forced smile looked at him. "Yes, sir. Do you want to open an account?" she asked, her voice polite but with a hint of impatience. The old man placed his sack gently on the counter. "No," he said softly, but with a firmness that made the teller pause. "I already own this bank." The teller froze, then let out a short laugh, thinking she had heard wrong. "Excuse me?" "She said, I said." The man repeated, his eyes calm and steady. "I own this bank." A few people in line heard him, and the laughter spread. A man in a suit whispered to his friend, "Looks like somebody's been in the sun too long." The teller shook her head, trying to hide her smile. "Sir, I think you're mistaken," she said. "This bank is owned by Bring Me Your Manager." The old man interrupted. The teller hesitated, but something in his voice made her pick up the phone. Within moments, the bank's manager, a tall man in a dark blue suit, walked out from his office. He looked annoyed. The kind of man who didn't like his day interrupted. "Yes? What's going on here?" the manager asked, glancing at the sack with mild suspicion. The old man looked straight into the manager's eyes. "My name is Elijah Brown," he said, "and this bank was built on my family's land. It was promised to my grandfather that if the debt was not paid in full, the land and everything on it would come back to us. That time is now." The manager blinked. Then, like everyone else, he smiled, not kindly, but the kind of smile people give when they think they're hearing nonsense. "Sir, this bank has been here for over 100 years." The manager said, "Yes." Elijah replied, "And I've been waiting just as long for justice." He reached into the sack and pulled out a thick, worn leather folder. The smell of old paper filled the air as he set it on the counter and opened it slowly. Inside were yellow documents, each carefully kept in plastic sleeves. The top page was a deed, dated in the early 1900s, with Elijah's grandfather's name signed at the bottom. Beside it was a second paper, an agreement signed by the bank's founder, stating the terms of repayment in gold. The manager's smile began to fade. The handwriting, the signatures, the official stamp, all looked real. He leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "This isn't a joke," Elijah said quietly, "and this sack is full of more proof letters, receipts, even photographs. I am not here to beg. I am here to collect what belongs to my family." By now, the laughter in the room had died. People stopped pretending not to listen. The air felt heavy, every ear catching every word. The young teller's face had turned pale. A security guard stepped closer, but the manager raised his hand to stop him. "Elijah," the manager said slowly, "perhaps we should discuss this in my office." Elijah nodded, lifted his sack again, and followed the manager past the curious eyes. Some customers leaned over the counter to watch him go. Others whispered, "Who is he? Could this be true?" Inside the office, the manager shut the door and lowered his voice. "Mr. Brown, these papers, if they are real, could mean serious trouble for this bank." "They are real," Elijah replied, "and you will see that soon enough." He reached into the sack again and pulled out a thick bundle of envelopes, each marked with dates from decades ago. "These are the letters your bank never answered." He said, "Letters from my father, from my mother, asking for what was promised." "And here," he added, pulling out a small, locked metal box, "is the final proof." The manager stared at the box, then at Elijah. "What's inside?" he asked. Elijah smiled faintly. "Something that will make you wish you had paid my family long ago." The manager swallowed hard outside the office. The sound of voices was growing louder. News of the strange claim was spreading through the bank. Reporters and curious townsfolk were gathering at the windows, trying to see. In the middle of it all, Elijah sat calmly, as if he had been here before. As if this was the moment he had waited for his whole life. The manager leaned forward and whispered, "Sir, if this is true, we may have to pay you." "Everything." Elijah closed the folder, rested his hands on the sack, and said, "I'm not here to take your jobs, but I am here to take what's mine." The manager closed the blinds in his office. Shutting out the curious faces outside, the room felt small now, the air heavy. Elijah sat in the chair across from him, his sack resting on the carpet like a sleeping animal. The manager took a deep breath. "Mr. Brown, you understand these are very serious claims." He said slowly, "I understand," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "I have been preparing for this day for 50 years. The manager reached for the leather folder again. Flipping through the old papers with careful hands, he could see the faded ink. The signatures of men who had been dead for decades. The original deed, the agreement, the gold repayment terms. Everything looked frighteningly real. His mind raced. If this was true, the bank's history wasn't just stained, it was built on stolen ground. Outside the office door, muffled voices were growing louder. One of the tellers knocked softly and whispered, "Sir, the news is already outside. Someone called the local TV station." The manager's face tightened. He waved the teller away and locked the office door. "Mr. Brown," he said, leaning forward, "why bring this to us now? You could have come years ago." Elijah's eyes darkened. "I did come years ago," he said. "I came to your father. When he ran this bank, he laughed, just like you did this morning. My letters were ignored, my calls unanswered. But I never stopped keeping records, and I never stopped waiting for the day your contract would run out." The manager's hands twitched. "My father. Never mentioned he wouldn't." Elijah interrupted because he knew the truth. He reached into the sack and pulled out a stack of envelopes tied with twine. They were addressed to the bank in neat handwriting. On some, the stamps were so old they were worth money themselves. "These are every letter my family sent to this bank," Elijah said, each one asking for what was owed. Each one ignored. The manager flipped through them, his throat dry. Some were from the 1970s. Some from the 50s. And then there was one. Dated 1919, written by Elijah's grandfather himself. The paper was fragile. The ink almost faded. It said in simple words, "We expect the gold by winter." As promised, the manager put the letter down slowly. "This could ruin us," he whispered. Elijah nodded. "That's not my problem," he said. "Your bank made a promise. Now it's time to keep it." Outside, the sound of footsteps grew heavier. Reporters were pushing their way into the lobby, cameras ready. The murmur of the crowd turned into a low roar. People were arguing, some saying Elijah must be lying, others saying they believed him. A few older townsfolk remembered stories their grandparents told about the Brown family owning half the land in the area. The young teller from earlier peeked in through the blinds, her eyes wide. "They're saying he's right." She whispered to another teller, "They're saying the Browns really did own this place." Inside the office, the manager ran his hand over his face. "Mr. Brown, if this gets out before we can handle it, the bank's reputation will be destroyed. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. "It's already destroyed." He said, "It just hasn't been written in your papers yet." The manager stood and began pacing. "We can make you an offer, a very generous one. You can walk away with more money than you could ever spend." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here for your hush money," he said. "I'm here for justice. My grandfather built his life on hard work. This bank took his land, his gold, and his dignity. I won't take a penny less than what you owe, and the bank itself, if it comes to that." The manager stopped pacing. For the first time, his confidence was gone. "You'd really take the bank?" he asked. "Yes," Elijah said simply, "and I'd run it better than you ever did." The office fell silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then there was a loud knock. "Sir," a voice called from outside. "The lawyers are here, and they've seen the documents." The manager glanced at Elijah. "Do you mind if they come in?" "I insist," Elijah replied. Two lawyers entered, carrying briefcases. They greeted Elijah politely, almost too politely, and asked to see the documents for the next 20 minutes. They examined every page, every seal, every signature. When they were done, they looked at the manager with pale faces. "Sir," one of them said, "these appear to be authentic and binding." The manager's lips moved, but no words came out. One lawyer added quietly, "If this goes to court, we will have to pay him everything." The old man didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply closed the folder and slid it back into the sack. "Then I suggest," Elijah said, standing slowly. "You prepare yourselves." As he walked out of the office, the crowd in the lobby turned toward him. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. But Elijah said nothing. He just walked out the glass doors, the sack still over his shoulder. The sun hit his face as he stepped into the street. The laughter from earlier was gone. In its place was silence and fear. The next morning, the whole town was buzzing. In the diner, people leaned over their coffee cups, whispering about the old man with the sack at the barber shop. Men argued over whether Elijah Brown could really own the bank. Some called him a genius. Others called him a liar. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had never seen the bank manager look so pale. In his small wooden house at the edge of town, Elijah sat at his kitchen table. The leather folder lay open in front of him, along with dozens of other papers spread out like puzzle pieces. The smell of old paper filled the air. He was sorting them, preparing for what was coming next. On the wall hung a black and white photograph. It showed a tall, proud man in overalls, standing in front of a wide-open field. The man's hands were rough, his eyes bright. This was Elijah's grandfather, Henry Brown, the man who once owned the land the bank now stood on. Elijah stared at the photo, remembering the stories his grandmother used to tell. "Your granddaddy worked that land with his bare hands," she would say. "He didn't just plant crops, he planted dreams. And he trusted men who didn't deserve it when Elijah was just a boy." He overheard a conversation between his father and a lawyer. The lawyer was explaining that the bank had borrowed gold from Henry Brown to build its first brick building. The deal was simple: pay the gold back within 20 years, or the land returned to the Brown family. It was written, signed, and sealed. But when the time came, the gold never came back. Instead, there were excuses, delays, and eventually, silence. Henry Brown died, believing the debt would be repaid someday. Elijah's father tried to fight for it. He wrote letters, hired lawyers, even went to court once, but the bank had power, and power had friends. The case was buried under missing paperwork. By the time Elijah was a young man, the fight felt hopeless to everyone but him. He worked jobs no one else wanted, in factories, in fields, even as a janitor at the bank itself. All the while, he saved every penny. But more importantly, he collected proof, anything that tied the bank's present to its stolen past. He searched old courthouses, county records, and archives. Sometimes he found nothing for months. Other times, he uncovered documents no one thought still existed. One summer, while cleaning out an old shed on the family land, he found the locked metal box. Inside were Henry Brown's original contracts with the bank's founder. Along with letters of thanks for your generous loan of gold, Elijah had stared at those letters for hours. He knew then he had enough to win. If he could only live long enough to see the right moment, and that moment had arrived. The contract said the debt must be repaid by gold or equal value before the end of 100 years. If not, the land and the building became the Brown family's property. That deadline was tomorrow. And Elijah wasn't going to miss it. While Elijah reviewed his papers across town, the bank manager sat in a closed-door meeting with the board of directors. The mood was grim. The lawyers explained that Elijah's claim had legal weight if the documents were genuine, and so far, they appeared to be. The bank was in serious danger. One director slammed his hand on the table. "Why haven't we heard about this before?" The manager didn't answer. He was thinking of his father and the years he ran the bank. Had his father known about this? Had he hidden it? One of the younger directors asked, "Can't we destroy the papers?" The lead lawyer shook his head. "He has multiple copies, and I suspect he has already given some to the press." Sure enough, by afternoon, a headline appeared on the town's news site. "Local man claims ownership of bank produces historic evidence." The story spread quickly. People from neighboring towns began arriving, hoping to see the drama unfold. That evening, as the sun went down, Elijah walked to the town square. A small crowd gathered when they saw him. Someone called out, "Is it true, Mr. Brown? Do you really own the bank?" Elijah didn't raise his voice, but everyone heard him. "My grandfather built that land with his own hands," he said. "He loaned the gold that built your bank. They promised to pay, and they didn't. I am here to collect what belongs to my family, and I have the proof to take it." His words echoed in the quiet square. A few people clapped. Others just stared, but no one laughed. Not anymore. Later that night, alone in his home, Elijah placed the leather folder back into the sack. He locked the metal box. Tomorrow was the deadline. By the end of the day, he would either walk into that bank as its rightful owner or fight them in court until his last breath. Far across town, the bank's lights burned late into the night. The manager and the lawyers whispered strategies, but no matter what they planned, one thing was certain: the old man had changed the game. The laughter from yesterday had turned into a quiet, gnawing fear by morning. The story was everywhere. The town newspaper had Elijah Brown's picture on the front page, the leather sack hanging from his shoulder like a soldier's weapon. The headline read, "Local man claims bank ownership, century-old promise resurfaces." Radio stations were talking about it, and the TV news vans were already parked outside the bank. People who had never cared about bank business now stood in groups, debating what would happen next. Some were excited. About time someone stood up to them. An old farmer said at the diner. Others were doubtful. "He's just looking for attention," a shopkeeper muttered. But no one could ignore it anymore. Elijah's fight had become the town's biggest story in decades. By mid-morning, the bank's lobby was packed. Customers had come to do their usual business, but most were there for the show. The marble floor echoed with voices. Reporters with notepads and cameras jostled for position near the front counter. Security guards stood stiff, trying to keep order. Then the glass doors opened. Elijah Brown stepped in, moving with the same slow, steady walk as before. He wore the same faded clothes, the same scuffed shoes, and over his shoulder was the same heavy sack. The crowd went silent for a moment. Then the clicking of camera shutters filled the air. A young reporter hurried forward. "Mr. Brown, is it true? You have proof this bank owes your family ownership?" she asked. Elijah didn't stop walking. "It's not just proof," he said, "it's history. And history cannot be erased." The bank manager appeared from his office, his face tight with tension. "Mr. Brown," he said loudly, "I think we should continue this conversation in private," but the crowd had other ideas. "Let him speak." Someone called out, "Yes, let's hear him." Another shouted. Soon voices rose together. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Elijah stopped in the center of the lobby. He lowered the sack to the floor with a thud that made a few people flinch. Then he reached in and pulled out the leather folder. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the agreement my grandfather signed with the founders of this bank. They borrowed gold to build their first building, and in return they promised to repay it within 20 years. If they failed, the land and the bank would belong to my family." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, and camera flashes lit the walls. The bank manager tried to interrupt, but Elijah's voice carried over the noise. "They failed," he continued. "They kept the land, they kept the gold. And they hoped no one would remember. But I remembered." He opened the folder and held up the deed. The yellowed paper shook slightly in his hands, but his voice was steady. "This paper is over 100 years old. Signed by my grandfather and by the man who built this bank. Every word is legal, every signature real, and tomorrow the time they were given to pay will run out." The manager stepped forward, his tone forced calm. "Mr. Brown, this is a private legal matter, not something to be discussed in front of the public." But Elijah didn't look at him. Instead, he looked at the crowd. "When they took from my family, they did it in public. When they laughed at us, they did it in public. So now, I will claim what's mine in public." A cheer rose from one side of the room. Even some customers who had come to do business clapped quietly. The bank manager's jaw tightened. The tide of opinion was turning against him. From the corner, one of the bank's oldest customers, a white-haired woman with a cane, spoke up. "I remember your grandfather," she said to Elijah. "He was a good man. He helped my family when we had nothing. If he said they owed him, then they did." Her words carried weight, and people nodded in agreement. The bank's lawyers, who had been standing silently near the back, exchanged nervous glances. They could see it. The more public support Elijah gained, the harder it would be to fight him without looking like villains. A reporter asked, "Mr. Brown, what will you do if the bank refuses to pay?" Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll see each other in court. And I'll bring every piece of proof I've collected, every witness who remembers, and I'll keep fighting until they do the right thing." The manager finally raised his voice. "This is a place of business, not a circus. Everyone who isn't here for banking needs to leave now." But no one moved. The cameras kept rolling, and Elijah calmly picked up his sack. "I've said what I needed to say today," he told the crowd. "Tomorrow, you'll see the rest." As he walked out, people stepped aside to let him pass. Some reached out to shake his hand. Others whispered words of encouragement. Outside, the sunlight was bright and sharp. The news vans followed him, their microphones held out like spears. The bank's manager stood in the doorway. Watching Elijah disappear into the crowd, he felt the weight of every camera on him, every suspicious eye. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was a public one, and the public was starting to choose a side that night. The news replayed Elijah's words again and again. In living rooms across town, families watched the quiet old man speak with more power than the richest men in the county. The story was no longer just about a bank and a sack. It had become about dignity, justice, and the right to be heard. And as the clock ticked toward the final deadline, both sides knew tomorrow something would change forever. The night before the deadline, the town barely slept. Some people stayed up talking about what would happen. Would the bank pay Elijah Brown? Would they fight him in court? Or would they find some dirty trick to make the whole thing disappear? Elijah didn't sleep much either. He sat at his small kitchen table, the leather folder and the metal box in front of him. The ticking clock was the only sound in the room. He thought about his grandfather, about the long years his family had waited for justice. Tomorrow would be the day. And whatever happened, he was ready. Just after sunrise, there was a knock at his door. When Elijah opened it, the bank's manager was standing there. Behind him were two lawyers and a man Elijah didn't recognize. A tall man in an expensive suit with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Brown," the stranger said, holding out his hand. "I'm from the State Banking Board. I think we can resolve this matter without all the noise." Elijah didn't shake his hand. Instead, he stepped aside. "If you've come to talk, you can come in. But you won't be leaving with anything that belongs to me." They stepped inside, sitting around the same table where Elijah had planned his fight for years. The stranger placed a thick envelope on the table. "This is an offer," he said. "A very generous one. If you accept it, we'll pay you more than most men see in their lifetime. In return, you'll drop your claim. No more public statements, no court, no trouble." Elijah didn't touch the envelope. "How much?" he asked quietly. The man slid it toward him. $5 million, he said. "It's yours today. Tax-free. You can live the rest of your life in comfort. No more fighting." The room was silent for a moment. The number was big, bigger than anything Elijah had ever seen. The bank manager leaned forward. "This is fair, Elijah. Think about it. You could buy a better house, help your family, travel. Why go through the stress of court when you can have this now?" Elijah looked at each of them slowly. "My grandfather didn't sell this land for money," he said. "He loaned it to help this town grow. The bank took it and never paid him back. This isn't about making me rich. It's about keeping a promise." The man in the expensive suit forced a smile. "Promises don't keep the lights on, Mr. Brown. Money does." Elijah leaned forward. "And dignity keeps a man's soul alive. I have lived without your money for 80 years. I can live without it for the rest of my days, but I won't die knowing I let you buy my silence." The stranger's smile faded. "Think carefully. If you refuse, we will fight you in court. For years, you could die before you see a penny." Elijah's voice was calm. "Then I'll leave this fight to the next Brown who comes after me, and the one after them. You can delay justice, but you can't bury it forever." The bank manager shifted uncomfortably. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Mr. Brown, you're making a mistake. This is the best deal you'll ever get." Elijah finally touched the envelope and pushed it back toward them. "You've already taken enough for my family. You won't take our name too." The stranger's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. Elijah stood up. "No," he replied. "The only thing I regret is that my grandfather isn't here to see this day." They left without another word. When the door closed, Elijah stood for a moment, breathing deeply. He looked at the photograph of Henry Brown on the wall. "We're almost there, grandfather," he whispered. Later that morning, Elijah walked into the town square. The crowd was even bigger than the day before. Reporters had set up cameras. Townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder. Now, the bank's front doors were shut, unusual for a weekday morning when Elijah appeared. People began to cheer. He walked to the center of the square, set down his sack, and faced the crowd. "They came to my house today," he began. "They offered me $5 million to walk away, to pretend my grandfather never owned this land, to pretend their promise didn't matter." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Elijah raised his voice. "I told them no, because justice is worth more than money. Because a promise is worth more than gold. And because if I take their deal, I sell not just my rights, but my family's honor." Applause broke out. Some people shouted his name. Others had tears in their eyes from the edge of the crowd. The bank manager watched, He could see it now. The public was with Elijah. Every day this dragged on. More people would turn against the bank. The offer had failed, and now the final showdown was inevitable. Elijah lifted his sack and looked toward the bank's locked doors. "Tomorrow," he said to the crowd, "the debt comes due, and I'll be here to collect." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the square. Both sides knew the next day would decide everything. The morning of the deadline arrived like the opening scene of a war. By sunrise, the town square was already full. News vans lined the street. Reporters adjusted their microphones, and cameras were set on tripods aimed at the bank. Some people carried handmade signs that read, "Pay him what's owed" and "Justice for the Browns." Others just came to witness history inside his small house. Elijah Brown sat quietly at his table, the leather folder and metal box beside him. He wore the same clothes he always wore, faded but clean. He didn't dress for a show. He dressed for truth. The sound of the old clock ticking felt louder than ever. When it struck 9, he stood, slung the heavy sack over his shoulder, and stepped outside the moment Elijah appeared on the street. The crowd reacted. Some clapped, others called his name. Reporters swarmed him, but he kept walking. Slow and steady, every step echoed like a drumbeat in the tense morning air. At the bank's glass doors, 2 security guards stepped aside. The bank manager was waiting inside, flanked by 2 lawyers and a representative from the state banking board, the same man who had come to Elijah's house the day before. Manager's expression was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Elijah Brown," the state official said in a formal voice, "today is the final day of the agreement made over a century ago. We are here to settle the matter once and for all." The crowd pressed against the windows outside, trying to see. Elijah set the sack on the marble floor and opened it. He pulled out the leather folder and handed it to the nearest lawyer. "Every paper, every signature, every seal is in there," he said. "Your bank took my grandfather's gold, promised to repay in 20 years, and failed. The contract says the land and everything on it returns to my family if the debt isn't paid. Today, that promise comes due." The lawyers flipped through the papers quickly, but carefully. They already knew the truth. They had seen these documents before. The signatures were real, the terms were clear, and there was no record of payment. The official from the state banking board spoke again. "We have reviewed the evidence. There is no legal record of repayment. By law, the property and all assets tied to it must revert to the Brown family. Mr. Brown, you are now the legal owner of this bank." A gasp went through the crowd outside, followed by cheers. Inside, the manager's face turned pale. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but the lawyer beside him whispered, "It's over." Elijah stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle. He thought of his grandfather's weathered hands, his grandmother's stories, his father's endless letters. He thought of the laughter, the dismissals, the locked doors, and now, here he stood, the rightful owner. The manager cleared his throat, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Mr. Brown," he said. "On behalf of the bank," Elijah raised a hand. "On behalf of my family," he interrupted. "I accept what should have been ours 100 years ago, but I'm not here to close this bank. I'm here to run it fairly for everyone. No more lies. No more cheating hard-working families out of their homes and land." The crowd outside cheered louder, some even pressing their hands to the glass. The state officials stepped forward. With a folder, "This is the transfer of ownership," he said, handing Elijah a pen. Elijah signed slowly, his name written in a steady hand despite his age. When it was done, the official shook his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Brown. It's not every day that history is corrected." Elijah nodded. "History doesn't correct itself," he said. "People do," as the news spread. Reporters rushed forward with questions. "What will you do first as the new owner?" one asked. Elijah thought for a moment. "I'll start by forgiving small debts for families who've been struggling, and I'll open the doors for people this bank once turned away." The manager stiffened, clearly unhappy, but he no longer had a voice in the matter. This was Elijah's bank now. The doors opened, and Elijah stepped outside into the sunlight. The cheers hit him like a wave. People reached out to shake his hand, pat his back. Some older folks had tears in their eyes, remembering the Brown family's kindness generations ago. From the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "Henry Brown would be proud." Elijah turned toward the sound, smiling faintly. "I hope so," he said softly. Though most couldn't hear him, the cameras flashed, reporters shouted, but Elijah didn't bask in the noise. He simply walked down the steps, the bank's new deed tucked under his arm. The sack was lighter now, not because it had less in it, but because the fight it carried was finally over. As he walked through the crowd, someone handed him a small bouquet of flowers. He accepted them with a nod. His path led him away from the cheering and toward the quiet cemetery at the edge of town. Tomorrow, the bank would open under his name, but today, there was one more thing he needed to do. The sun was warm, the air still, as Elijah Brown left the town square behind. In his hands, he carried two things: the new deed to the bank and a small bouquet of wildflowers. The crowd's cheers still echoed faintly in the distance, but Elijah's steps were quiet now. This part of the journey was not for cameras or headlines. It was for family. The cemetery gates creaked as he pushed them open. The grass inside was neatly cut, the stones weathered with time. He knew exactly where he was going. He had walked this path many times before, past rows of names that told the story of the town, until he reached a simple, strong headstone. The name carved into it read, "Henry Brown, 1865 to 1933. Elijah stood there for a long moment, looking down at the grave. His voice was soft but steady. "Grandfather, we did it," he said. "They tried to bury the truth. They laughed at me. They told me I was wasting my time. But today, the bank is ours again." He knelt and laid the flowers on the stone. His fingers brushed the carved letters, as if the stone could feel his touch. "I wish you could have been there to see it." "Ah," he whispered. They had to stand there, in front of the whole town, and admit what they owed. It took 100 years, but they finally paid. Memories came to him of his grandfather's stories, his father's letters, his grandmother's voice telling him to never give up. He could see them all in his mind, sitting around a small fire in the old farmhouse, speaking of justice. As if it were a living thing, he realized that justice was never quick, never easy, but it was always worth the fight. The sound of footsteps made him turn. A small group of people had followed him quietly, neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had been at the square. Among them was the white-haired woman with the cane who had spoken up in the bank lobby. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes bright with tears. "Henry was a good man," she said softly. "You've given him his honor back. And you've given this town a reminder of what's right." Elijah smiled faintly. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "This was my family's fight, but it belongs to everyone who's ever been told they don't matter." One of the younger men in the group asked, "What will you do with the bank now?" Elijah looked out toward the town in the distance. "I'll run it the way it should have been run all along. No more turning away farmers because their land isn't big enough. No more charging unfair fees that keep poor families poor. If someone works hard and tells the truth, they'll have a place in my bank." The white-haired woman nodded. "That's how it used to be," she said. "That's how it should be again." As they stood there, a light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of flowers. Elijah felt at peace, but also aware that this was only the beginning of another kind of work. Winning the bank had been the fight of his life. Keeping it fair would be the fight of his remaining years. When he returned to town that afternoon, The square was quieter. The news crews were packing up, but people still stopped to greet him. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded with respect. It was different now. No more mocking looks. No more whispers behind his back. People saw him not as an old man with a sack, but as the man who had stood his ground and won. The next morning, the bank opened its doors under new ownership. The sign still bore its old name, but the change was already felt. The first customers were a young couple who had been denied a small loan the year before. Elijah met them personally, listened to their story, and approved their request. The wife had tears in her eyes when she thanked him. "It's not charity." Elijah told her, "It's a fair deal, the kind my grandfather would have given you." Word spread quickly. Within a week, farmers who had been struggling came to refinance their loans. Shop owners asked about better terms, and families who had been turned away before finally stepped through the bank's doors without fear. The old sack still sat in Elijah's office. It no longer needed to carry proof. Now it carried a different kind of weight. It reminded him of every mile he'd walked, every paper he'd guarded, every no he'd turned into a yes. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the bank's front windows, a reporter returned to ask one last question for the follow-up story. "Mr. Brown," she said, "how does it feel to own the bank after all these years?" Elijah thought for a long moment before answering. "It's not about owning a bank," he said. "It's about proving that promises matter. It's about telling every person in this town that they have the right to stand up, even when it takes a lifetime. That's my legacy. Not the building, not the land, but the example." The reporter nodded. "And what happens when you're gone?" Elijah smiled gently. "Then it'll be someone else's turn to carry the sack," he said. As the day ended, Elijah stepped outside and looked at the bank. The same building that had once been a symbol of broken promises now stood as a symbol of what could be made right, and somewhere deep inside, he felt his grandfather's pride. The fight was over. The legacy was secure.